Okay, so thanks for joining and welcome to this Sentry workshop on how Cloudflare built a Sentry client to help developers catch exceptions in Cloudflare Workers. So this is the third installment of a Sentry integration workshop series, which aims to highlight the stories of companies who have built tools that extend Sentry's code observability capabilities. So in this episode, I am super excited to have Sachin and Robert here from Cloudflare to share a little bit about Cloudflare Workers, Toucan-js, what they are building, and yeah, how this has supported the efforts of their company.
Awesome. Thanks, Angela.
Okay. Really quick, the agenda, we're going to go through introductions, and then I'll pass it over to Shana to talk a bit about how to you can build on Sentry. And then we'll get going with our fireside chat. And Robert will provide a quick demo, and then we'll wrap this up within the hour. So these are our presenters today. Like I said, Sachin and Robert from Cloudflare, and we have Shana, who is our awesome developer advocate from the Sentry side. Okay, now I'll pass it over to you, Shana. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Angela. Super. Yeah, so today, this is kind of a continuation of some different workshops we've been having about building on top of Sentry, building integrations for Sentry, building stuff that makes Sentry better. So today, if you could pop to the next slide, I'll just kind of set a little context. So in some of our previous workshops, we've talked about building integrations to Sentry, but we've really used the word integrations in a few different ways. And today we're talking about a different kind of integration. So the different ways we use that word is integrations can be SDKs that people build for Sentry to make Sentry work with their certain platform where they're writing code, or they can be things like public integrations, like using Sentry with Slack, so to get Slack notifications from Sentry, or internal integration, so something that you build for your company, specifically internal to you, to function, do whatever you're doing better with Sentry. Today, like I said, we're talking about a Cloudflare SDK that folks from Cloudflare made to make Sentry work really nicely with their Cloudflare Workers serverless platform. So I think we can go ahead and kind of jump into the chat portion. Why don't we have, let's start with Sachin. Why don't you give us an introduction to you? What do you do at Cloudflare? And then you can pass it over to Robert to do the same.
Sounds great. Thank you, Shana. So my name is Sachin. I'm in SF. My favorite vacation is cave diving in Mexico. So that is a little intro about me. I work as a tech lead at Cloudflare, and I work on the API team. And so whenever you ask Cloudflare a question on the API, it in some way touches something that my team does. So that's essentially my role at Cloudflare. So hand it to Robert.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sachin. My name's Robert. I'm a software engineer at Cloudflare. My favorite vacation is probably traveling the world and exploring new places. I'm currently on Product Insights team and kind of on UI platform side team. So I have built a lot of features on Cloudflare dashboard. So whenever you log into dashboard, you probably see something that I have built.
Awesome. Thank you. That's great. Super helpful. I will also do my little quick answer for my stuff too. I'm Shana. I work at Sentry as a developer advocate. I am in the Seattle area, and my ideal vacation, someone in chat or in the Q&A said Hawaii, and I feel like I have to agree, especially living in the Seattle area. It's like a pretty quick flight over and you're just like in paradise immediately. So I love that. Okay, just for the format of how we're going to be doing this, we're kind of structuring this mostly as a fireside chat. So I've got some questions lined up to ask to Sachin and Robert about Cloudflare and about Workers and about the SDK that they made for Sentry. So I'm going to jump into some of those. And then at some point, we will also see a demo from Robert of what the SDK actually looks like. Cool. So let's get into it. First of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about Cloudflare, what Cloudflare does, and then also please tell us about what Workers are from Cloudflare.
Sure. So Cloudflare is a web security and performance company, and it does way more than that. But think of it as a large global infrastructural network, and we have points of presence in, I think, the number keeps growing and changing, but it's 275 points of presence around the world. And so a good way to think about this is Cloudflare kind of sits in front of your website, and we take the hit for you getting a DDoS attack or any sort of like security things that we can see. We provide firewall, load balancing, and all of these features so that you don't have to sort of worry about it and need to sort of constantly wrangle your backend to prevent downtime and all of these other things. So that's one side. And then the other side of stuff that we do is zero trust, trying to replace like VPN stuff, things like that. And then the question that you asked, well, what is Workers? And it kind of bleeds into serverless technology, where why do you even need to think about your server at all? Like, yes, we provide all the things, but like, can you just focus on writing the code and building your application? And that's kind of what Workers allows you to do, where it abstracts the infrastructure of where your code is deployed, where it lives. You don't need to worry about that, because it's always going to be closest to your customer, and it's always going to scale infinitely, and it's always going to be there when you need it. And so you don't need to really have people on call or constantly updating these servers, because it's similar to like infrastructure as a service is a good way to think about it. But you kind of have the ability to just write this code, deploy it magically somewhere, and just focus on the business logic of what your application is kind of doing. So yeah, that's my spiel on Cloudflare and Workers.
Awesome. Thank you. And for folks maybe who are here who are familiar with serverless, at least from my experience, my first introduction to serverless was AWS Lambda. And I know Workers is a little bit different actually in how it works than maybe some other tools like Lambda or other serverless platforms. Can you tell me a little bit about Workers specifically and how that technology is different?
Yeah, so Robert, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can take this one. So basically, the model of Worker is kind of different because it doesn't run containers. It runs isolates, which eliminates cold starts and makes them super fast. But due to that model, it kind of forces you to write code differently. And maybe you are familiar from AWS, you are familiar with Node.js or some other technology. So Cloudflare actually is more close to kind of service worker format that you are used to in browser environments. So everything in Worker is basically event-based. And that forces you to kind of think differently about how you handle things like variables, because in Workers, you shouldn't use globals, because Workers can handle multiple requests in parallel. And so they could override each other's global, and that could cause some problems.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Appreciate it.
And one of the other things also to quickly mention is you don't really have to worry about regionality. So if you deploy your Worker, it does actually go to everywhere the Cloudflare has points of presence. So you don't really have to worry about, well, I have to provision this region for my application, and then only like North America, it's really fast. But the moment you like head to Europe or like some other place and it's across the ocean and things like that, you see degradation. And so that's not really a thing in Workers. It just magically works everywhere. So that's another big performance benefit of kind of using Workers.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that's super helpful to know about. Quick note for our attendees, thank you for being here. We have chat enabled, so feel free to jump into the chat with Q&A or questions as we go along. I was just typing that up to put in the chat for y'all. Awesome. Okay. So I personally have experienced as a developer that sometimes debugging and dealing with errors in serverless code comes with challenges, which having a tool like Sentry or other APM tools is really helpful in that case. Can you guys talk a little bit about challenges with finding errors in Workers and challenges you guys ran into with trying to send errors that happen in Workers to a logger or a service like that?
So a good way to kind of think about this, right? Like when you own your own server and you own the application that's running on the server, you can kind of open up the insides of the box and kind of see like where things are blowing up. And you can, a lot of times people will var dump like logs or just dump out traces and things like that. And they're like, I don't know what's broken. I just want to see everything and I don't really care. And that is kind of harder to do in serverless. Serverless does not mean no server. So those are two separate things, right? There is a server. You just don't need to worry about how it's running and where it's deployed, or like who turns on that server, who turns off that server. Doesn't matter. You just write your code, and if you're writing code correctly, it just works all across wherever it's deployed. And so that comes with certain nuances where generally the way it kind of changes the model of looking for an exception, where usually developers will attach to some screen and or SSH into some box somewhere and tail some logs and like do some weird regexes to try and like figure out like where did this thing actually blow up. And that's kind of hard to do. Like there is no screen there. Like there is a server, but I'm going to say there is no server from your perspective. So trying to drill down into these errors can be kind of hard if you don't know what you're looking for. And so you have to kind of front load all of the information that you're going to require when you think a thing is going to blow up. So it kind of changes the model in that you need to know how these errors are potentially going to show up in order to add that information beforehand to be able to see it when you can log that error. The other thing is, this is not like Workers, like Robert mentioned, aren't like traditional programs that are running nonstop and have a process that spins up and shuts down over time. And it's just a thing that's always available to you to go look at like, hey, what's the health of my process? These things like show up and go away. And they're doing that all the time, many times. And again, you don't need to worry about why or how that's happening and how these processes are spinning up and shutting down. But that kind of makes it hard because you try to look for the error, but the error is no longer there because the process that was running the error is no longer there. And so it's a different model to wrap your head around. And so it forces you to, like Robert said, write code differently, like capture exceptions differently. And we'll go through an example later too of the hardships that we saw trying to do this, and how we kind of over time ironed those out with the SDKs and things that we ended up building.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Sachin. Yeah, we'll definitely get into more of that as we talk about what Toucan-js, the SDK you guys built, is and how it solves some of those problems for y'all with workers. A little bit more prelim here, though. Curious about Cloudflare's relationship with Sentry. How long have you guys been using Sentry? How did you guys get started with Sentry? It's like a lot of work to build an SDK for Sentry. So would love to kind of know about your guys and how you use Sentry and why this was important enough for you guys to invest in.
I've known Sentry, or the folks at Sentry, personally for a while now. They came into the office one day and they were like, "Hey, do you all want to make a video about Sentry?" And if you go to the Sentry marketing page, it's me doing funny, silly things with hats on the Sentry page. But that was my first introduction to Sentry. And some of the reasons that we initially started adopting Sentry is because we had all these errors, but it was kind of hard to figure out how to do something actionable with them. And specifically on the front end, because we needed a way to send those errors securely to a place that we could like kind of look at them. And so what ended up happening over time is we realized that Sentry was able to categorize, fingerprint, and give us information about actionable things that we could do. And so we would see an error and we were able to kind of be like, oh yeah, okay, that's where the error is coming down from. And so there's two modes that I generally think about operating in Sentry. Is just like the general health of your system. So if you suddenly see a ton of errors coming in, Sentry is like a great, even though it's not your alert monitoring system, it's generally a good sign that something has gone horribly wrong. And so we would do releases and like quickly look at the Sentry dashboard to kind of see if stuff has gone horribly wrong. And if Sentry was like, I don't see anything horribly wrong, it's like, okay, cool, that's great. And then the other mode of operation is something's blowing up and it's very specific. It's kind of hard to find. And so having tags and having bits of information that allowed you to slice and dice the errors was really useful. And so and interestingly, initially we were sending so many errors to Sentry, we actually ended up overwhelming the Sentry logging pipeline. And then that's where the relationship kind of grew, where we worked with each other and ended up working together to try and make things better. We would make pull requests to the open source repos, get feedback, things like that. So that was that's a solid partnership right there. So.
Yeah, to me, maybe the first time I used Sentry was when I joined Cloudflare, and what was kind of mind-blowing to me was that there is some JavaScript, minified JavaScript that is transpiled, and it runs on some user device somewhere in the world. And what was really great was that I could see exactly where the error happened in my code, in my editor, thanks to source maps, because source maps actually map the minified code to whatever code you write as a developer. So that was a really great feature. And another thing that we did on the front-end side was that we used this feature called user feedback. So whenever something crashes in the dashboard, it will render like a text area where you can write feedback. And that is actually powered by Sentry and sent to Sentry. So we could immediately see after the release, not only the actual crashes, but also the feedback from the actual humans, from our users.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. You guys all mentioned really great stuff. If you, a person on this webinar, are not linking your source maps into Sentry, you absolutely should be doing that. It's incredibly powerful. Like Robert said, it's one of the things that enables that magic experience of something goes wrong somewhere in the world, and somehow through the magic of Sentry, you can just see on your own IDE like what lines of code are causing a problem. And yeah, the user feedback API is not, I don't think it's one of our most used or like most talked about features that we have, but it is really cool. It enables like users to actually communicate with you, and you can learn from your users about what went wrong to get that extra insight. Okay, thanks for that, Brett. You sent it just to the panelists, so I'll mention it to the folks. Y'all haven't been able to get source maps to work. I'm sad to hear that. Please jump in our Discord. I don't know if Angela, you can send out a link to our Discord. There are folks at Sentry, like tons of Sentry employees chill in our Discord, as well as other customers and like super engaged people in our open source community. We'd love to help you figure that out. It's so important. Okay, cool. Great. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for letting us know about your guys' relationship with Sentry. I think it's really cool. I agree. Sentry and Cloudflare have kind of grown together over the years. We love a great relationship. Cool. So let's start talking about Toucan-js specifically, which is your guys' also open source SDK for Sentry for Cloudflare Workers. Can you give us just a quick 2-sentence summary of Toucan-js from your guys' own words?
So Toucan-js is basically an SDK for Cloudflare Workers. So earlier we talked about nuances in Cloudflare Workers and how you should write the code. And as Sachin mentioned earlier, Cloudflare Workers don't run constantly, right? They spin up, they do their work, and they shut down. And so in Cloudflare Workers, you need to explicitly tell the runtime to wait for your logs to be delivered. If you don't do that, the Cloudflare runtime will shut down and your logs don't go to Sentry. So the Toucan was designed with that model in mind, and it takes care of all of that for you, so you don't need to worry about it. That was more than 2 sentences.
That's good. It was helpful. Thank you. All right. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about before you had Toucan-js, you guys were still trying to use Sentry with workers. Can we talk a little bit about what that looked like and what your strategy for using Sentry with workers was before the SDK? And I will also, as you guys are starting to answer that screen, pull up the couple visual slides we had for talking about this stuff.
So I'm a huge Sentry advocate. It is one of the things where when a dev starts a project, I'm like, well, what are the Sentry links and Sentry DSN? So a lot of our projects have first party Sentry support where you just toss in Sentry DSN and it'll provision things for you. So it is one of the tools that we knew we had to have in workers and try to figure out, well, we're spinning. And so to give you a little more context, we had api.cloudflare.com and we were like, well, you know, it is one of our internal biggest properties. So let's try to spin up a worker on api.cloudflare.com. And just as an FYI, both the dashboard, so dash.cloudflare.com and api.cloudflare.com are sit behind workers. So if you make a request, your request is touching a worker. So anyone that's made a Cloudflare request, it's touching a worker. So we wanted to, because we get millions and millions and millions of requests all the time, we wanted to make sure we knew when we deployed this worker that something, either we did it well or everything was kind of bad. And so if you think about the circular nature of this problem, it's really interesting because we have so workers live on api.cloudflare.com, but the worker that lives on api.cloudflare.com is deployed by api.cloudflare.com. And so if you break the worker on api.cloudflare.com, you can't fix the worker on api.cloudflare.com. So that was an interest. So that kind of put the fear of God in us in that, well, if we break this, we have to be able to kind of fix this system, right? So it was an interesting problem. So the image that you kind of have on the left-hand side is the old way we used to do this. So we started out with not knowing anything in terms of how Sentry would interface with workers. And so we started digging into the Sentry SDKs and what happens when you Raven.js is the JavaScript client. So we busted it open and we're like, well, what happens? What is the final thing that Raven.js does that makes the API call? And so this is what we settled on. Raven.js makes an API call to that Sentry URL with certain keys and a payload. And so we started dissecting that payload. And this is basically the minimal amount of stuff that we settled on, that we were like, okay, we can send this stuff without worrying that it's going to explode or not. You can see it's kind of almost similar to a curl call, and we're very much concerned about the internals of how things are happening. So it's like, well, does the error, is it of a type like error? Does it have a value or a message? If it doesn't, just mark it as unknown. Stringify the JSON body, send it as a post method. Here's the actual raw URL. And so that got us more tied to how the Sentry API was kind of working. And then right at the bottom, this is something that we realized later, where we were manually trying to trigger logs and things like that to make sure everything was hooked up correctly. And sometimes we saw the logs and then sometimes we didn't. And it was interesting. We would, the more code or the more things, the more time the code would execute, like we would see the logs. And so we're like, oh, this is essentially a shutdown problem. The logs are not being sent because the runtime is shutting down before that log line is executed. And so this is the reason, if you look at the a lot of the Sentry SDKs, there's a explicit command right at the end that is flush. So you flush the logs before shutting down your process. And what Sentry will do is basically hold the process open till all the logs are sent and then shut down. And that's what you want. Your thing blew up. You don't want it to just blow up. And so you're kind of holding the gates open before that shutdown process happens. And so we've discovered that that last line, log the error, is very important because you want to wait until that function actually executes. And so that's something important to note in your workers. Make sure there's a wait until in here. The other thing that was really useful is something called pass-through on exception that workers also has. And what pass-through on exception allows you to do is essentially eject the worker if an error happens and pretend like that worker never existed. And so you can see how this is kind of useful, where if we're generating millions of requests and you blow up a ton of those requests, you kind of want the worker to pretend like it didn't exist and it's not in the path. So instead of returning a 500 immediately or blowing up in the code, it'll eject itself from that request path and then redo the request to your origin like it never existed. So that's really cool because you kind of, it gives you the ability to kind of experiment with the workers and just, play around with it for a little bit without having to worry about doing too much damage. But you can do too much damage as your worker kind of grows, because the other side of it is, think about if you're doing auth in your worker, or if you're doing rate limiting or security things in your worker, you don't want your worker to fail open. If there's an error and it can't sort of calculate if you're allowed to have access, you don't want to just say, yes, you're allowed to have access, like go through. You kind of want it to blow up. And so based on what kind of worker you're trying to spin up, think about either using pass-through on exception or not using pass-through on exception. And this is all sort of in the workers docs as well, but it's just those few things that we usually forget to, it's just one line and you forget, and then you're like, workers behaving weird, and you're like, well, why is it behaving weird? And then it's you forgetting to write this one line of code. So that's all the old stuff. It worked fine, wasn't a problem. But then what ended up happening over time is Sentry would add new features, or we'd want more information, and we would have to touch this highly critical piece of infrastructure to go in and like figure out what needs to change, and then redo all that testing stuff, redo all of that pass-through on exception stuff, make sure all of the logs are actually getting sent. So we were like, this is too much. We need something better now. And then Robert was like, you know what? I'm making a thing. And then he wrote Toucan-js, and it was great because it allowed us. So the left-hand side is old stuff, and then the right-hand side is all of the new stuff. And so if you compare the two, on the right-hand side, there's no Sentry URL. It's just give me your DSN, give me your environment, and give me a few more variables here and there. And there's no if error, send a thing or send unknown or all this other stuff. There's sort of no inner workings. It's just configuration. So you're just configuring your error handler. And this is generally how you want your code to look. You don't want your error handler to be extremely worried about how it's sending the errors and where the errors are going. And you just want to be able to configure it. And then same thing at the bottom of the Toucan-js. Still important, you still need to wait for the logs to actually get sent out. So this is also something that people generally forget. And then also another thing to note on the left-hand side is we're sending in all this additional information with like, send the error, send the request. But because your Sentry client is kind of pre-configured, you can sort of capture exceptions in many places as you set up your Sentry handler. So you could just do now capture this exception, now capture this exception, now capture this exception without having to worry too much. So this is cool, but you're like, well, what did it actually do, right? So the thing on the left-hand side, you're like, it does the same thing as the thing on the right-hand side. Well, kind of. So if you go to the next slide, this is where the real magic shows up, where we knew when something blew up, but this was sort of the limit of how we were able to configure our custom error handler. And so we would be like, well, you know, it's an internal error, something blew up in production, and here's when it happened, and here's some IDs and things like that. And it's a little minimal, to say the least. And so it's kind of the like alarm bells going off, like something blew up, go look at it. And no one on call wants to kind of see this as their first point of contact, right? Like, hey, something blew up, go fix it now. So we wanted to fix that. And so the right-hand side is what Toucan does just out of the box. That little code that we wrote does all of the, well, where did it come from? What was the route? How did it, what was the stack trace? And so immediately we can go to that line of code and be like, whoa, that's where it blew up. And it's really cool because it also says invalid URL string. And so it's better than, oh, something just internally errored and I don't know what it is. And so these two are sort of similarly generated errors. So you're writing less code to get more. The other thing that's really awesome is Sentry can change the API and we don't have to worry about it. All we would have to do is bump Toucan-js whenever Toucan-js got its update, and our stuff would magically keep working. So having this abstraction layer really protects us from needing to know where the logs are going, how they're being handled. And so the moment Sentry introduced performance and other things, like you just get it for free and you get it out of the box the moment Toucan adds support. So you don't need to actively provision performance and do all these manual API calls. So the old world was, it worked and that's about it. It was hard. And the new world is cool and the one we want to live in. And so that was kind of how things existed and how they kind of exist now.
Yeah, that's great, Sanjay. Yeah, it's funny because you look at the number of lines of code and it's not really that different in terms of what you were doing before and what you're doing now with Toucan-js, what you're able to do. But in terms of the impact of like what that actually means for developers, this is so much more useful of something to see in Sentry. And also the type of code that you're writing is just much more sane. Like adding these lines of code from Toucan-js to every worker where you want to debug stuff is a much better experience and just makes more sense for the kind of stuff you want to be writing in production.
And to your point, the other thing is also, well, now we're using like fun environment variables. So in like, we actually don't even need to change the code if we change what the Sentry DSN is, right? Like if you just provision a new environment variable and it all magically continues to work, things like that. So
yeah, for sure. Okay, awesome. That's great. Thanks for telling us at this higher level. Well, it was pretty detailed, but thanks for giving us this overview of what you were doing before and compare and contrast. I think it would be great now if Robert, you want to go ahead and give your demo, talk through more detail about Toucan. Maybe you can talk about what it was like making Toucan, what it was like building an SDK for Sentry, and yeah, show off what you made. I will stop sharing my screen as well so that you can share. Yeah, and also folks in the chat, if you have questions, please let us know. We would be super happy to answer.
Cool. Can you guys see my screen?
Looks good to me.
Okay. Right, so my story was kind of similar to Sachin's story. I was working on a team that started dog-fooding workers very early, and we built this giant monorepo for workers that allows you to spin up new worker code quickly and deploy them and develop on them. And so the major challenge I wanted to solve is that teams don't need to write Sentry code from scratch, because when you write your own Sentry code, your own Sentry code can actually explode, and you have different problems there. Like as Sachin showed in his example, right? Like it was kind of trying to serialize the exception object, and many people don't know this. People who write their own Sentry code is that in JavaScript you can pretty much throw anything. It isn't always error object, right? So you can throw like strings or number or vanilla objects, and so there is like a lot of potential for exploding your workers just with your Sentry code. So the priority for me was to write code that is well tested, that other teams can just reuse. And my other goal was that the API of that library is kind of in line with official Sentry SDKs. So when developers are used to call, capture exception in Raven.js or whatever was used in the front end at the time, I wanted that function in Toucan to also be called capture exception, so they don't need to like figure out how to do that. So this is the repository for Toucan.js, and if you scroll down to documentation, you can see that there are some starters for various bundlers that provide source maps out of the box. So one of my other goals was also solve source maps immediately, so that teams don't need to set it up. So all these examples have working source maps. So my favorite bundler is rollup. So let's show how to start a rollup worker with Sentry. So here are some instructions. You obviously need Cloudflare account and Sentry account to do this. And you need some environment variables. So first variable you need to set up the client is called Sentry DSN. So when you go to your Sentry dashboard, you can simply find it in your project settings. So I already created a new Sentry project called Toucan. So when you scroll here, you will find your DSN. So just grab it and add it to the configuration. Workers are managed with Wrangler, and you can set environment variables in Wrangler. So I already have environment variable called Sentry DSN. So I will just add the value here. And this basically gets you started with client. But if you want source maps, you also need these three variables. So Sentry organization, Sentry project, and Sentry out token. And all of that is already set up in my environment. But just to quickly show you how to get them, Sentry organization You can find Sentry organization in your general settings. So in my case, it's my name. Sentry project is basically your project name. So my project name is Toucan. And the last environment variable that you need is Sentry out token. So you can simply find it on this URL. Just create your token here and add it to your environment variable. Cool. So once you have all your variables, there are 3 commands. There are 2 commands that you can run. One is to deploy the worker to Cloudflare's network. And the other one is to kind of run a development copy of worker. So this is powered by our open source workers runtime called workerd. So this actually runs the identical worker runtime that runs on Cloudflare network locally on your machine. So that might be useful if you want to quickly test things out. Cool. And to quickly show what the code is doing, it's very simple worker that creates a Toucan instance and tries to do something in the handler, and then calls Sentry to capture the error if an error is thrown. And our handler intentionally is set to do something stupid. So in this case, we are trying to parse JSON. There is no JSON, just so we can test how Sentry works. Cool. So let's deploy our worker. Simply run yarn deploy. Which compiles the worker, generates source maps, and uploads source maps to Sentry. And once that's done, we can quickly test our worker. So in the console, you can see that it created a worker on this URL. So I already have it here, and just refreshing it kind of shows what we are expecting in this case. So the handler that was doing the JSON parse on a string thrown this exception, which went here to this catch block. So now we go to Sentry, and the exceptions should appear here. So this is what you get just by calling one function. You get all kind of information about your exception. You get stack trace. You get source maps. So this is the real code that actually runs in a worker is minified JavaScript. So this is exactly what is here in my editor in the handler. So the value you get just for calling one function is pretty insane. And this is usually what all you need in like 99% of use cases. But I usually like to do something on top of that. It is not necessary, but it can help you get more context about the errors. So the first thing I like to do is kind of add more contextual data about the request. So in Cloudflare Workers, request is the center of everything. And the chances are that at some point in your code, you are going to read that request, right? So when we read the request body, as JSON, you can simply set that body context to be attached to all future events. And so you might be asking why the SDK is not doing this automatically. And the reason is, in some cases, especially when you use workers as a proxy, you don't want your SDK to read the body stream, because that would need to allocate more data in memory, and it will slow down your application. So when the workers is used as a proxy, you typically want to pass through the entire request without reading the body. But if you use your workers as some REST API that potentially stores request data somewhere else, then it's a nice thing to do. And to quickly show how that translates to Sentry dashboard, we are going to post a simple request with some JSON payload. So now we go to issues. It's not there yet. Oh, actually, I forgot to deploy my worker. That's useful. Let's try that again. And it's here. And the body is empty. Why is it empty? Oh, because I haven't awaited the JSON. So that's interesting. When you get promise, it gets serialized as empty object. Just in case you are wondering. So, and while we are waiting for this, maybe something about the requests. So at Cloudflare, we are very serious about users' privacy. And so we treat the requests as toxic assets. We don't want to log all request data automatically because things like headers or cookies may contain some PIIs. All right, so I designed the Toucan with that in mind. Toucan actually doesn't log any cookies or any search parameters unless you explicitly tell it to do that with allow list. So the only thing that you get out of the box is request path name. And we should already see request body here. Right, finally it's here. So this is how you set the request body. The other thing I like to do is to track tags and extras. So tags and extras are kind of KV values that can help you filter your Sentry events. So for example, maybe let's show how to set the tag. So you can simply call Sentry set tags. And what I like to, one of my favorite tags is service, because many systems that I have built are kind of distributed systems, so they actually use more workers. So it's useful to know which worker exactly is throwing your exception. So in this case, I'm going to call my service Sentry worker. Another useful function to call is set user, which is kind of, under the hood is kind of a special tag. So if your worker is doing some authentication, it might be useful to track some user ID. So in this case, I'm just going to generate some random ID. And let's deploy that.
Yeah, this is great. Do we have that error? Maybe if we, as we wait for it, we got a couple questions. I'd love to hear Robert an answer from you. Brett was curious if using Toucan increases the runtime of the workers, like in terms of as it's waiting for logs and waiting for stuff to get sent to Sentry, I assume. Either into like total time, like wall clock time or CPU time.
It increases both. There is very little computation that Toucan does, but obviously it also affects wall time because you have to wait for the request to actually be delivered because before the workers goes down. But it doesn't actually affect your request hot path, right? Because the main reason we are calling wait until under the hood is to kind of do the work whenever the worker has time to do that work, right? So as you can see here, we return the response to the client, or in case of exception, we return a response to the client here. So your user will get the response in many cases before the worker actually starts delivering a request to Sentry, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's great.
Cool.
Brett,
So
sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So our error is here. So as you can see, the tags appear here. And they are useful because you can simply click on them and filter your errors by the tag. Right. So this is showing all errors that have the service entry worker. And your user information shows up here. Important information I forgot to mention is Sentry tries to track IP addresses automatically. So when you create your Sentry project, it's useful to go here to Security and Privacy tab and disable the storing of IP addresses. Cool. So that's for Sentry tags. And the last useful feature I like to take advantage of is breadcrumbs, because in many cases in workers, you are not going to get stack trace. For example, if you had some runtime limits or whatever, you are not going to see stack trace. So the question is, where does my error happen? Right. So I like to grab console log and use this function, which basically sends additional information to Sentry. So it has category that can be console and messages your log. And the way breadcrumb, I'm not going to show this because we're running out of time, but the way breadcrumb shows in your Sentry event is below the error message here, you will see all your logs that led up to the point of your exception. So that's also very useful.
Yeah, this is great. Toucan does a lot for you. I love that it's automatically giving you your source maps too. Great. We only have a few minutes left. It looks like Sachin, you're answering Brett's other question about Ray ID. Thank you, appreciate it. If anyone else has questions, feel free to drop them in Q&A. We'll try to get to them before we finish, or if not, we can answer them over in Discord. I can help get those answered. Cool. I think one fun thing to end on would be the naming of Toucan-js. I'll preface this by saying I noticed you guys calling our JavaScript SDK Raven.js, which is, you can tell you guys have been customers for a long time because we don't use that naming anymore. We just call it like the Sentry JavaScript SDK, but would love to hear your guys' explanation for why you called your SDK Toucan.
Yeah, so it's kind of a fun story because we at Cloudflare we have built like multiple logging pipelines, and for some reason we like to call them after birds. So we have an analytics pipeline that is called Sparrow. So we kind of like to follow that trend, and also Raven.js is also a bird, right? So we kind of like wanted to be aligned with the naming.
That's right. Yeah, that's funny.
It's pretty hilarious also because all of the logging functions initially were named after sounds that birds make. So it would be like sparrow.chirp or fly, and then eventually we realized like it's not a good idea to do that. Don't do that to your developers. It is funny for a bit, but then log error is better.
Yeah, a little bit more intuitive there. That's great. Yeah, I was going to mention, I was curious when I was looking into this why we called our SDKs Raven initially. And the reason is actually it's a StarCraft reference. And so is Sentry, the name of our company, actually. Sentry and Raven are both like classes from StarCraft, which I'm not a huge StarCraft person, so I didn't put it together. I don't feel bad. But yeah, just interesting. Fun tech names. We always have to have our goofy little inside jokes. Great. Okay. Looks like any more questions? Just gonna check quickly. Okay. Nathaniel asked, is there a way to link Sentry with Azure Application Insight? Something with correlation ID, perhaps? That is a great question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, and I highly suspect our Cloudflare folks don't know the answer either. But Nathaniel, if you're not in our Discord already, please join. I will ask around for the answer to that and get that to you. Cool. Anything else? Any parting words from Cloudflare folks? You guys want to promo hiring or anything like that?
Yeah. So I think the Cloudflare careers page is on our in the description and things like that. So go check it out. Cloudflare is a really cool place. We build cool things, and I also bought a little toucan to the event just to have extra bird vibes. So yeah, and if you all have any more questions, toss them in here before we jump off. So yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I will also say I will drop in some links of if you are in theory interested in making your own SDK for Sentry as well. Robert, we didn't get a ton of time to talk about this and the actual process of building the SDK, but we have pretty good documentation actually about how we've made our SDKs, the philosophy of how we do it, the features we expect to be included. And if you go, like I said, all of our SDKs are open source, and Robert basically went in and based how he wanted his to look on our Node SDK. Which he said to me earlier that it worked pretty well to go in and do that. So I have it on good authority that that's a fairly functional and sane way to build your own SDK. But check out the docs. Those are also open. So if you have any problems on the docs, feel free to find them in the GitHub repo and leave an issue or comments, questions, all very welcome.
We'll also be sharing the recording for this webinar, as well as all the links that we walked through today in a follow-up email. So look out for that.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks all attendees for coming. Great questions. Good to have you. And thanks, Robert and Sachin, for sharing your expertise and talking to us about Toucan.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Happy
Yes.
weekend, y'all.
Yeah, almost.
Well,
All right, bye, everyone.
everyone.
Bye-bye.